Selling my house, gate closed, an old wife inside. 3 hours later, a buyer arrived. I remember the blue dot on my phone like a sudden bruise. It flashed on the kitchen counter beside the chipped cup I used every morning, the steam of coffee rising and disappearing into the heat of the day. The coffee was bitter, as it always was, small penance for staying awake with nights of ironing shirts, paying bills, and learning to recognize silence as a language Osvaldo spoke more fluently than any word. I took the first sip, and the world tipped. That line was ridiculous and cruel all at once. It landed in my lap like someone closing a door too loudly. The message spread faster than the dust in the hallway, through neighborhood WhatsApp groups, from one neighbor to another, in voice notes that rolled with laughter and pity like thunderclouds. People forwarded it with emojis, with comments, with a casual cruelty that made me feel naked in a room full of strangers. My phone became a mirror whose reflection I did not know. We had been married 35 years. 35 years of ordinary things that make a life, the rusted keys, the calendar with its missing months, the stack of unpaid receipts I used to smooth out like a small, futile shield. I had been a university student once, pages of notes tucked under the mattress like confessions. Then marriage, a move to this house in Sector Jiao, a child, 100 tiny decisions that seemed at the time like small offerings for a larger peace. I washed his shirts, tended a garden that people complimented without seeing the hours it took, learned the names of the birds that nested in the manguera in our backyard, and slowly, almost imperceptibly, the study table became a place to iron and fold, the books boxed and given away because the house must be neat when guests come. No one told me that erasing small things adds up to losing a name. For years, humiliation arrived in small increments, offhand comments at dinner, the way he would correct the way I pronounced a word as if I were a child. I learned to hold my place and wait. The neighbors had opinions that stuck like lint. "She's patient," they would say, as if patience were a medal. When I spoke up, I was either dramatic or unreasonable. When I stayed quiet, I was invisible. It is surprising looking back how routine invisibility becomes until someone points a light at it. Before that blue dot, there were signs I had begun to see. I began to see because I had to, because the pressure built until it cracked. It was a suggestion from my daughter, gentle as she could be. Maybe talk to someone. Dr. Beatriz was no miracle worker, but she had a way of asking questions that were like windows, open, frame, light. "What do you notice when you're quiet?" she asked once, and the ridiculousness of the question made me laugh under my breath until I cried. Therapy took months of slow scraping, removing the old varnish of excuses, naming acts that had been brushed away as jokes. The work was small, stubborn things. Learning to say, "I'm tired," and not defend it. Keeping a notebook of little moments that mattered. Practicing a word I had rarely spoken aloud anymore. No. My first no did not arrive with trumpets. It arrived like the first clear note of a tune you thought you had forgotten how to hum. It happened over the kitchen sink. Osvaldo asked me, in his usual clipped way, to cancel a plan I had made with a friend to fix an old chair. I felt my body tighten, and as the familiar script flickered in my head, agree, smooth it over, apologize, I found my mouth refusing the line. "No," I said, and it landed softer than I had feared, but more solid than I expected. The sound startled both of us. He made a small face, the same one he made when he tried a new brand of coffee. "Why not?" he asked. "Because I offered, and I will go," I answered. It was not dramatic. It was a practice in the shape of a sentence. He frowned, turned and left the room, and I was left with the odd tremor that follows the first jump into cold water. Dr. Beatriz had said later, with that direct warmth she kept, "Your first no is not a victory parade, it's a seed." She drew a tiny diagram on a sticky note, simple arrows toward each other, one labeled expectations and the other desires. She told me to keep that seed in the light. I planted it in small ordinary gardens. I allowed myself to go meet friends. I asked the neighbor to trim the footpath branches and kept an old notebook next to the phone so I could write down unjust moments when they happened. It felt indulgent and dangerous all at once. A neighbor lady saw me once on the sidewalk and said, "You look different." She meant new hair or new clothes, but it felt like a recognition that went deeper, like someone finally reading the title of a book and not just skimming the dust jacket. I did not expect the public humiliation to arrive in pixels. The image posted on the neighborhood feed was one of our house at mid-morning, the gate closed, the Manguera casting a lazy shadow on the pavement. Someone had taken the photo from the corner, the angle that made the beaded curtains at the window look like a curtain on a stage. I do not know if it was Osvaldo who composed the caption, or if he had dictated it into someone else's phone. I only know it spread. The wording turned me into furniture in the voice of a joke. It was a slap made of letters and likes and replies. People who had smiled to me at the market used laughing gifs. Some sent heart emojis because they thought it was a funny way to announce something ordinary. Others were explicit in their pity. The message threaded through the group, and with each forward, a small part of my dignity fell into the digital tide. When I first saw the notifications pile up, messages with the house's photo, others with screenshots, voice notes passed around like gossip, my hands began to shake. I fumbled the phone and nearly dropped it. I walked to the living room, to the old wooden banister that had been smoothed by our hands over decades, and gripped it like a child. I felt the heat of the Goiânia day through the glass, the house humming in its usual way. Fridge, the faint clock of the electric meter, the distant engines of a city that keeps being itself while my world rearranges. Osvaldo came in from the garage like a man bringing a trophy. He stood in the doorway, arms folded, chest slightly puffed. "I posted it," he said, as if announcing a success. "Selling the house, gate closed, wife included." He said it like a clever line. His smile was a small victory. My heart sawed between something that wanted to burst into anger and something that wanted to rest, exhausted. I had been humiliated many times inside the house, mocked in private, corrected in public, but being made the subject of a neighborhood joke transformed shame into spectacle. Where private pain had been a thin, sharp thing, public humiliation wounded in a wide and stupid way. Neighbors who once nodded politely now had an entree to comment, and teenagers sent each other the post with howls of mirth. I thought, this will pass. People forget. Not everyone reads the whole story in the same way, and embarrassment has a short season. But Osvaldo did not pause there. Later that night, in a voice that tried to sound reasonable, he told me a buyer would come in 3 hours. 3 hours. He said the words like a bell. He wants to see the house before the weekend. He'll arrive in 3 hours. His foot tapped on the tile, a metronome for my breath. I tried to ask a question, and the room for that brief moment felt like too big an ocean for my words to swim. He laughed once, a short sound, and walked away. The gate creaked closed behind him. 3 hours. It was absurd and perfect, an exact measure of time that left me exposed and meant for display in the market I had been reduced to. I sat in the cool of the tiled floor and watched the shadow of the Manguera move slowly as the sun rolled. The tree had always been there, old, patient, a witness that had seen us young and then older, its trunk thick and grooved. In the backyard, I had planted a small citronella hedge to keep the mosquitoes down and a line of marigolds that a child had once given me for my birthday. The Manguera shaded the kitchen at noon, and at night birds that nested within its branches sang like a small orchestra. In those 3 hours, 1,000 small decisions piled into one mountain. Panic wanted to be loud and immediate. Pack a bag, flee, call someone. Steady determination repeated a line I had practiced in therapy. Gather what you need. Do not let the event make decisions for you. It is important to stress, there was no grand plan in place. There were only the practices of a woman learning to answer for herself. Documents I had kept in a drawer, a birth certificate, bank statements, my old diploma tucked into a book behind the pantry, receipts from years ago that recorded what people had thought was unimportant. They mattered now more than anyone could have guessed. I called Dr. Adriana. Her voice on the phone was cool and precise, all the things a lawyer should be when the world requires a scaffolding of order. "Stay put," she told me without sensation. "Don't sign anything. We will see the contract intention and the deposit. Keep the messages." She sounded like someone reading from a playbook, which is what lawyers are trained to do, a book full of measures. I told her, but did not fully tell her how I felt. How the house felt like a thing that had always belonged to both of us and yet was being offered like a piece of furniture. She said nothing about diagnoses. She listened and then asked about the bank. I read her a few lines from the neighborhood group. She asked if there were witnesses who could attest to his statements. The word witness made me see my life in a sudden legal frame I had never imagined. I gathered the papers I could find, the original property tax receipts, my name on the water bill for years when I had been the one paying, letters from my mother, an old magazine clipping of a fundraising event I had attended with the name I had before marriage still beside it. I stacked them on the dining table. Each paper was a small island of proof. Collecting them was not a single act of grace, it was a litany against erasure. In the meantime, I moved through the house like an actor in a play I had not rehearsed for. I washed my face until the skin prickled. I put on a dress that someone years ago had given to me for a celebration I barely remembered. It was a cotton dress, faded at the collar, with tiny blue flowers. I wore it because its thread had never been worn thin by Osvaldo's eyes. The choice of clothing felt, absurdly, like reclaiming a syllable in a language I had nearly forgotten. Neighbors came and left like tides. Some peered at the gate and whispered, like they were reading from a script. Others sent me messages, some with cruel laughter, some with tenderness. Maria from next door, who had once fed me empanadas, left an iced bottle of water on the porch and a note, "You are not alone." Small acts matter. That note pressed flat under the bottle was one of the things I placed in my pocket that day, as if it were a coin of reassurance. I did not sleep. I spent those hours sorting not only papers but memories into boxes, old photographs, letters, a child's crayon drawing with a sun that always had too many rays. I stood sometimes at the window and watched the street, careful not to watch too long because watching felt like waiting for something improbable. At some point between the second and the third hour, I walked into the garden. The manguera's leaves whispered in the wind as if nothing terrible were up for vote at all. The scent of metal polish still lingered from a morning when I had wiped the doorknob thrice to get rid of spots no one had noticed. I sat at the small wooden bench and touched the grooves on its arms with my thumb. The wood was warm. Under the bench, ants marched in a line, oblivious to the theater happening on the other side of the gate. I thought about Enrique. He was a name I had not allowed to be part of my day for decades, like a melody I had not wanted to play because it carried both sweetness and a peculiar ache. We had been young, both of us clumsy and bright-eyed, first loves who promised the world with a naivete that made every future seem possible. He had left, went to Europe, as he said he needed the air, with an intensity that was almost a joke. We had written letters for a while, then the letters slowed. He married once, a small news item that made me imagine two people in a tiny kitchen somewhere else. Years later, a quiet message reached me in the middle of an afternoon. His wife had died. He had returned to Brazil after some time abroad, opened his own business, and the city spoke of him with a mixture of admiration and curiosity. He was a name people said with a tilt if they knew him, the man who had left, the man who did not speak too loudly about his past. I had not seen him in 25 years. I had not expected to see him again. In those final minutes before the buyer arrived, my thoughts went back to him like tide to the shore. Not because I wanted rescue. Those ideas are a story told by people who do not understand how stubborn dignity can be, but because memory is itself a company of small lights. I stood under the manguera and felt the bark like a palm print against my back, a reminder that the tree rooted long before any of our chosen stories. The gate creaked as a car rolled up the street. A sound I had come to know as the one that changed everything. Present tense now, because the moment needed the immediacy that language can give. The engine hummed, the tires made that small whisper on gravel. I felt the walk of time in my bones, minutes like grain counting down. The driver left the engine idling. Two men stepped out at first, one in a shirt the color of milk and another with a briefcase. But it was the third figure that made me stop breathing for an instant. He moved with a calm that looked practiced. There was a slightly unfamiliar tilt to his shoulders, as if he had worn many skies. Up close, the years were written on him in the soft lines near his eyes, but his presence carried the keen memory of a younger man I had once known. He walked slowly, taking in the house with a gaze that felt less like appraisal and more like recognition. As he reached the gate, their brief conversations were polite, the sort of chatter that leaves out too much. Osvaldo, for his part, stood straighter than he ever had at family dinners, as if he were playing a role that suited him finally. He stepped through the gate, and for a suspended moment time felt like glass, clear and fragile. Our eyes met. "You?" I said without thinking. The word was small, a single syllable that contained a raft of oceans. He smiled, something quiet and close, the kind of smile that does not ask anything of anyone. When he spoke my name, it landed like rain hitting dry soil and making a small luminous pool. "I thought I might find you here," he said. I could have closed the gate and remained where I was, standing beneath the manguera and counting the leaves, letting the moment be a private thing. Instead, I stepped forward. There was something in him, an absence of showmanship, a respect that did not need to be performed, that settled into the space between us. He did not pry. He did not offer a theatrical rescue. He simply looked at me as if seeing me, not the old wife in a caption, not the caricature circulated for amusement, but a woman who had a story and a right to the telling of it. He told me, in a few quiet sentences, that he remembered the smell of jasmine in my mother's yard, that he had followed the neighborhood in small, unobtrusive ways after he returned, that he had only learned of the post like everyone else, but had decided to come see for himself. He said, without flourish, that he had lived many places, that he had been alone for a while, that Europeans had taught him the habit of not making assumptions. He had the kind of clarity that comes from living far from the small gossip circuits of a place and returning with observation rather than opinion. I will not pretend that my heart leapt the way stories in books say they do. It flickered like an old bulb, sparking a memory, our younger laughter, a shared joke that was stupid and warm. But more than nostalgia, what I felt in that moment was the uncanny relief of being seen by a stranger who remembered me. His presence shifted the field. It made a new kind of silence possible, one that invited rather than frightened. Yet I would not let him become the fulcrum of my fate. I had, in the hours before, made small decisions that mapped out a course. I had the papers on the table, the messages saved, Dr. Adriana's phone number on speed dial. Enrique's arrival might complicate the scene, might make Osvaldo rethink his performance, but it would not replace the work I had begun. I had learned to own my choices. He turned to Osvaldo with a polite, neutral nod, and spoke about the house in a voice that was precise, businesslike. The other men took notes. For a moment, everything returned to the ritual of a negotiation. Measurements, questions about fixtures, the questions sellers always ask. When can you leave? Will the appliances go? The old familiar choreography of buying and selling things swirled around us like dust motes. But the presence of that recognition, of someone who had loved me once and could still look at me and not miss my entire history, changed the choreography. It was a quiet shift, less like a hand grabbing a steering wheel and more like a wind that suddenly turns the sails. Osvaldo's face tightened then, something between annoyance and calculation. He had not accounted for a past arriving as an inconvenient witness. His voice, when it came, tried to be buoyant and in control. "We can talk details," he offered, a practiced line. 3 hours had turned into one single moment that held more than practicalities. The street outside hummed with ordinary life, a child's bicycle bell, a rooster somewhere distant, the slow drone of a bus. My hands, folded at my waist, remembered the way my mother used to fold them when she wanted to look dignified. I felt the weight of dignity in that small, familiar gesture. I saw then the small truths I had been collecting over the years as if they were bookmarks. There was the photocopy of my diploma tied up with string in the bottom of a drawer. There was the receipt from the community fundraiser where my name appeared among volunteers. There were the messages from neighbors who had once offered small kindnesses. These were not grand proofs. They were the quiet architecture of a life, the sort of evidence lawyers like to call collateral because it is not dramatic but persistent. Enrique walked closer, and for a moment all business and private history braided in a way that felt delicate and dangerous. He looked at the corner of the house where the paint had peeled around the kitchen window. He paused by the manguera and brushed his hand along the bark with the kind of familiarity one might afford only to things that have been loved. He did not speak of the post like it was a joke. He did not laugh. He simply asked a question about the paperwork in a voice that was steady and unobtrusive. Inside me, something that had been fragile and half-formed pulled itself upright. I felt steadier. I had always thought that rescue stories were either lies or rare miracles, but real life makes room for small alliances and unexpected witnesses. Enrique's arrival could be a complication, yes, but also an opportunity for truth to be spoken in a setting where it might finally be counted. The men waited. Osvaldo shifted his weight from foot to foot, the same impatient posture he took when he wanted to force a decision. I felt the pulse of time, the last thin string before the present leapt into a version of itself that might be different. I was aware of the 3 hours that had led here like a set of dominoes, and of the many days before that when my identity had been chipped away. I held both of them, past and present, like separate threads. He looked at me again for a breath and said, "Do you want to show me the kitchen?" Simple, practical, but it was also, absurdly, a question that put me back in the center of the house. I hesitated a second that stretched like elastic. Then I nodded and reached for the doorknob. At that moment, the street outside seemed to hold its breath. The gate whispered as it opened. The birds in the manguera paused mid-call. I crossed the kitchen threshold, the same place I had stood for decades making coffee and measuring out small days, and I felt something shift. A slight reordering of memory and intention, as if the house itself could sense the possibility that it might be claimed differently than before. I moved through the rooms with a new attention that was almost painful. Each step was a question I asked myself. What is mine? What is shared? What can I keep without apology? I opened a cupboard to show a chipped cup, and in doing so, also showed a life. A life that people had tried to sell with a flippant caption. We walked into the backyard. The light through the manguera leaves made a pattern on the stone. Enrique stepped lightly between patches of shadow and sun, and for a second I saw him not as a man from my past, but as a witness to a house that had always been mine as much as anyone else's. Osvaldo cleared his throat and began to speak of terms. The other men consulted papers and tapped on screens. Enrique listened, occasionally asking for a clarification that forced Osvaldo to be precise. He asked about the deposit and the timeline, about whether any fixtures would be removed. The moment was everyday and extraordinary. Business on one level, and on another, a reckoning of what it meant to be seen and accounted for. There was a hum in me that was neither fear nor joy, but a kind of fierce concentration. I thought of the first no, fragile and remarkable, and of Dr. Beatrice's small seed that I had tended. I thought of the manguera and its patient roots. I thought of the blue light on my phone and how quickly a community could make a private person public. A car door slammed across the street, bringing us all back to the immediate. Osvaldo leaned forward, eager to show his power in numbers, but there was a caution in his mouth now, a recognition that not everything could be blithely controlled. It was as if Enrique's steady presence had shifted the air, and Osvaldo, who had always needed to be the loudest voice in the room, found himself momentarily muted by someone who did not play to his script. I was aware, with the strange clarity that crises bring, of the choices ahead. My life had been made of small acts, but here was a moment when a different kind of choice might matter. I kept my hand on the back of a chair, feeling the worn wood, feeling the grooves smooth from years of use. The chair was mine. It had always been mine. The question was whether the world would count that as anything more than a piece of used furniture. Enrique looked at me once more, his eyes steady, and said softly, "I didn't come to disrupt you. I came because I wanted to see the house for myself." There was no grand gesture in the sentence. There was a gentleness that did not seek to erase what had happened, but rather to witness it. For a woman who had been turned into a joke in public, the act of being witnessed without mockery felt, in its own way, like a small miracle. The gate behind us clicked as if someone were locking the day into a new shape. I felt a current run through me. Not rescue exactly, but the lightness that comes when someone else sees your name and says it without alteration. My hands unclenched. There was still a decision to be made. Contracts would be discussed. A deposit might be offered. Dr. Adriana would call again, and we would speak of papers and not of feelings. Osvaldo would try to steer the narrative back to where he liked it. His terms, his timeline, his face in the neighborhood's gallery of judgments. But for the first time in a long time, I stood in my own kitchen feeling like I belonged to the house in a way that did not require someone else's permission. The men clustered, their voices lowered into practical tones. The color of the sky over Goiânia was the particular kind of blue that makes you notice afternoons, not the bright, clean blue of the coast, but a warm, saturated blue that felt like the city itself. A breeze moved through the manguera, and a few leaves fell on the stone like small coins dropped into a bowl. Inside, on the dining table, the stack of papers I had gathered waited like testimony. I ran my thumb across the top of one and felt the imprint of the years, tiny fingerprints of ordinary life. My name was on some of them. On others, my handwriting, my signature, my small, unmistakable insistence that I had existed apart from the caption someone had chosen. Enrique bent to look at an old photograph left on top of a box. A younger version of us at a festival, laughing with too much light. He did not comment. He handed it back with care as if returning a relic. He said, "You kept things." His statement was not judgmental. It was an observation that in its softness gave permission. Osvaldo cleared his throat again and tried to steer the conversation to numbers. The men opened notebooks and clicked their pens. I inhaled the smell of metal polish and coffee and the green, earth-sweet scent of the manguera. My phone buzzed quietly in the kitchen, a blue dot blinking like an anxious heartbeat, and I imagined Dr. Adriana's steady face on the call. I felt the moment tilt somewhere between the immediate transaction and something larger. Enrique's presence complicated the shame that had been flung online. It inserted a witness who had once loved me without turning it into a spectacle. My hands reached for the papers, for the proof, for the small things I had gathered in a day that felt unexpectedly like battle and like harvest at once. The men looked to one another, waiting for someone to speak first. Osvaldo opened his mouth. The sun slid toward late afternoon, and the shadows of the manguera stretched across the yard like long hands. I could feel the 3 hours ending, the narrow window that had given me a chance to be seen and to prepare. When the first words came, they were not what I expected. They were quieter, as if the house itself had demanded a softer voice. And then, before they could find their form, a neighbor's engine sputtered, a child laughed down the street, and the ordinary world resumed its shape around our small, precarious scene. I stood with my hand on the back of the chair and thought of all the little acts, of saying no, of keeping papers, of leaning against a manguera and letting its roots remember me. I felt in my chest a kind of stubborn warmth that was not triumph but rather a gathering. Whatever would unfold in the hours and days to come, I knew that the account of my life could no longer be told solely by someone else's caption. The gate creaked again as someone moved at the edge of sight. Voices rose, practical and casual. Osvaldo's face tightened. Enrique adjusted his jacket and looked toward the street, his posture watching not only what was being offered, but who was offering it. The moment hung, ready to break into business or into something else entirely. I took a breath and stepped forward to meet it. They talked around me for a moment, the practical exchange of numbers and dates, the sound of people who make a living turning feelings into columns on a page, but I kept my feet planted, a small island in the current. Osvaldo tried his practice smile, the one that made family dinners tight and airless, and Enrique answered with a steady, deliberate courtesy that felt like a neutral light in a room full of spotlights. "Before anything," Enrique said, "I want to make sure the person who lives here is comfortable. I don't want to be part of something that hurts someone." His voice had the careful warmth of someone who had learned the value of not assuming a story. Comfortable? The word struck an odd chord in me, simple and sharp. I remembered the dress with little blue flowers, the smell of metal polish, the way the manguera leaves had printed cool patterns on the floor. Comfortable. I found my voice and used it. "If you are going to make an offer," I said, "I want to see the contract. I will not sign anything now, and I will not allow decisions about this house to happen without me in the room." There it was, the center of the moment. I did not shout. I did not throw the words like a weapon. I said them like a person who was remembering how sentences could be used to hold space. Osvaldo's eyes flicked to the men with him, searching for support, for a cue to bring the scene back into his order. He tried the theatrical laugh. "It's just the formalities," he said. "We'll sign the document of intention. It's a standard thing. He'll leave a deposit, and that's it." Enrique looked at him without a trace of mockery. "If there is a deposit, everything will be transparent," he said. "And I expect that the people who live here are involved in those steps. That is only fair." The word transparent had the strange effect of making the afternoon feel less like theater and more like a place you could breathe in. The men murmured, papers rustled, and for the first time that day I felt the long thread of my life, frayed and knotted, pulled into something that could be handled. Dr. Adriana called, her voice a thin, precise line of calm. I could hear the therapeutic coolness she kept for legal storms. "Do not sign anything," she said again, this time into the small room where the negotiation had gathered. "If a deposit is offered, it should be to a notary or into an escrow account, and we should review any document before you acknowledge it. Save everything." She was technical in the way a person becomes technical when their work is to shape messy things into rules. I listened, and while she spoke, I placed my palm on the stack of papers I had arranged on the dining table. For so many years I had been taught to smooth, to tidy, to make things look presentable. Now those papers, the faded receipts, the photocopies, the old certificate that still carried my original name, felt like a map of a country others had tried to redraw without asking. I was clumsy at first with this reality. I had not been raised for legal battles. But gathering proof was not the same as fighting. It was a careful domestic task done under the pressure of a different kind of heat. Enrique left the decision of how to make a deposit to his lawyers, but he spoke of a number that made the men around him look at their notebooks with a little less bravado. "500,000 is earnest money," he said. The phrase hung in the air, $500,000, like something both practical and symbolic. Osvaldo's chest swelled at the thought of numbers that could be shown off in the street. For his neighbors, money was a language that made him loud in a way he liked. Yet money alone was not going to rewrite what had already happened. The deposit, our lawyers agreed, would be something to place under watch. Dr. Adriana explained, in terms I could understand then, that if a deposit entered a formal channel and a claim were filed to prevent a unilateral sale, the funds could be secured while the dispute was handled. She did not speak as someone promising magic. She spoke as someone who had seen contests where stories and documents, not emotion, moved the scales. There were gestures of business, pencils tapping, measurements checked, but the scene's charge remained human. Enrique walked toward the manguera and put his hand on its trunk as if greeting an old friend. It was an ordinary touch, but in that touch I felt acknowledged. He asked me about the garden, about the marigolds, and listened when I spoke of the small ways I kept the house from feeling empty. Osvaldo watched, a tightness gathering at the corners of his mouth. By the time the men left, with the promise of a formal offer to arrive within days, and the talk of a deposit to be made through official channels, the sun had lowered into the kind of late Goiânia light I had begun to associate with miracles small enough to fit in an afternoon. The gate closed slowly after them. I walked to the kitchen sink and ran water over my hands until the hot tile under my feet felt grounding. The 3 hours that had been a countdown were over, but the story was only beginning. In a single day, the neighborhood and its WhatsApp feed had turned our house into a public drama. Now the public drama moved into legal rooms and offices. I sat at the dining table and read through the papers again. I made a list of names who might be called as witnesses. Maria, who had left the bottle of water, the woman from the corner store who remembered me helping when a blackout came, a neighbor who could attest to the noise and the times I had paid bills in cash. The first week carried the rawness of an open wound. Messages that had been malicious, forwarded like cruel confetti, began to slow. People still pointed from afar. Some whispered. A woman at the market lowered her eyes when she saw me and then, unexpectedly, said, "You were right to keep those receipts." Her voice had a steadiness that felt like iron. Small acts of solidarity collected like coins in a jar. They were not dramatic, but they kept me from becoming entirely buoyant or entirely adrift. Enrique's deposit arrived in the form they said it would. An official notice from a bank, a transfer into a secure account, and a paper trail that smelled faintly of bureaucracy and oil. It felt good to see that line of numbers and to know that a step had been taken with attention and legality. But in the same breath, my lawyer told me what she would do next. She explained, with the measured tone of someone accustomed to the litany of human trouble, that she would file for a temporary injunction to block any unilateral transfer of property, and that we would open a divorcio litigioso to address the patrimonial claims openly. The words were strange to me, foreign policy for a life that had not previously required legal flags, but they were also a shape I could put my hands around. There was, in those days, a sense of being simultaneously exposed and held. I still drank coffee from my chipped cup every morning. I still polished the silver sometimes, the smell of metal polish a small rebellion against a life that had been expected to look perfect for other people. But the daily rituals now felt different, less about smoothing over and more about borne witness. I met with Dr. Adriana and signed papers that I had not imagined signing, statements about ownership, about the household economy, about years of paying certain bills that had never been recorded as mine. I felt both like a novice and a woman who had been recording a long ledger without realizing the weight of each line. Osvaldo reacted in the way someone does when a script they've been reciting all their life is suddenly offbeat. At first he tried to reclaim the spotlight. He posted smug comments in the neighborhood chat as if nothing had happened. He paraded invoices and bragged about timelines. Then, when words did not suffice, he became menacing in subtler ways, calling late at night, sending messages with thinly veiled threats, arriving at the door with a face that tried to look unconcerned while his hand shook around a cup of coffee. It is important to say, because I do not wish to turn this into melodrama, that his fury was not theatrical. It was the anger of a man who saw his narrative of control loosening and could not accept that the house, which to him had always been a symbol of ownership and performance, might no longer be a stage curated solely by his hand. He accused me of betrayal. He said things people say when they want to weigh others down with guilt. I answered with the things I had learned in therapy, short truths, boundaries that were practiced rather than performed. Meanwhile, Enrique kept his distance from melodrama. He did not become my protector in the way stories often romanticize. He became instead a witness who used his resources to make the facts visible. He allowed his lawyers to coordinate with Dr. Adriana. He made sure that the deposit went into a channel where it could not be misused, and when the court, after a formal petition, issued an order that temporarily froze the transfer of funds pending the outcome of the dispute, he did not celebrate. He simply nodded and continued to look at the house as if cataloging what had been loved here. There were nights, those first weeks, when sleep eluded me. I would wake and imagine the worst-case scenes. Osvaldo selling without my consent, my papers getting lost, the house changing hands while I watched, powerless. But there were also small breaths of relief. Dr. Beatrice called sometimes and asked how I was feeling. Therapy walked me through the ways dignity is rebuilt, step by step. You do not need a dramatic transformation overnight, she said. Dignity is a set of ordinary acts that repeat until your body remembers them. She gave me small assignments. Go to the market on your own, answer a neighbor who asks about a day, plant something in the garden and name it. These tasks sounded simple, but they were the scaffolding for a self I had been neglecting for too long. The public chatter settled into a quieter form. People in the neighborhood stopped sending laughing gifts and started to send messages that read differently, some apologetic, some curious, some plainly supportive. A few neighbors came by with food, others kept a cautious distance. The social media storm had a life of its own. It blew hot and then cooled, but the legal processes moved on their own metronome, and that rhythm provided a strange comfort. There are times when formal steps, no matter how cold they feel, help measure progress in a way that gossip cannot. 30 days passed in a mix of waiting rooms and small domestic practices. We received a notification. The court had scheduled a preliminary hearing to assess the injunction and to hear, in broad strokes, both sides. I felt a tension the morning of the hearing, like the tightening of a string that might either break or play a clear note. I met my lawyers early. Dr. Va. Adriana had done the meticulous work of assembling the evidence, old receipts, messages, the printout of the neighborhood post, and the demonstration that my name appeared on certain utility accounts over years. She spoke of patrimonial violence in a way that treated the subject with the precision of someone expert in the language of bodies and property. It was a strange comfort to hear my life translated into language that courts would accept, if that is not an odd thing to say, that the quiet domestic ledger I had kept could be legible where public cruelty had made me unreadable. The hearing itself was a compressed day. I sat on a hard bench and watched other people move through loud moments. When my turn came, I stood, and my knees were steady. I did not theatrically recount every wound. I told the truth as it had accumulated. Years of invisible labor made visible in receipts and testimony. The public humiliation of the post, the deposit that had been lodged into an account with a message of intent. Dr. Adriana spoke with the clarity she had in private. She connected small facts to larger patterns without making grand claims. She asked the judge to consider a temporary freeze on the transfer until the matters could be sorted, and more importantly, to recognize the existence of a patrimonial dispute that required adjudication separate from a simple buyer-seller contract. The judge, a woman whose hair was braided tight back and whose glasses sat low on her nose, listened. She asked precise questions. She did not hand down a dramatic sentence in the old-fashioned way of films. She issued a formal decision that the transfer of title could not proceed while the dispute was pending and that the deposit would be maintained under the control of the court until further order. It was not a triumphal cry, but it was a seal of containment, an order that prevented rash erasures and gave time for truth to be heard properly. Osvaldo was furious. When the news reached him, he stormed into the house and accused me of conspiring with strangers. He rattled his old repertoire of insults and dominations, but something in him had been unsettled. The post he had proudly put on display was now the same evidence that undermined his control. His public boasting was now, in the eyes of a court, a kind of admission. He could not pretend that the caption was a private joke. The same network that made me a spectacle now provided a record. In the days that followed, the tenor of our interactions shifted. Osvaldo oscillated between petty attempts at control and moments of raw anger where he seemed to be bargaining with a life that had altered, in his eyes, without his permission. I will not pretend he changed into a caricature of villainy overnight. He remained in many respects the man he had always been, capable of charm, of quiet cruelty, of fatigue, and finally, of a small human despair. There was a hearing later where, after several procedural steps and the presentation of evidence, the judge did more than block a transfer. She recognized that there were patrimonial issues that needed to be negotiated within the structure of a divorce proceeding. She allowed, in practical judicial language, that the house could not be sold unilaterally until rights were clarified. The net effect was that the simple plan Osvaldo had announced in the neighborhood app of selling in a hurry was effectively stopped. Instead of the sale proceeding quickly, we entered a space where negotiation and litigation converged. Dr. Adriana argued for a solution that recognized my years in the household and the reality that assets in marriage are seldom the product of a single hand. She asked that the deposit remain unavailable until the court could decide. She also presented the possibility, as a practical settlement, that transfer could be rethought with the house registered in my name as a compensatory measure. It was not revenge, it was a reallocation that recognized what had been invisible. The strategy was to secure my future, not to humiliate Osvaldo further. When the proposal surfaced, a transfer of the property into my sole name as part of an agreement that would offset patrimonial claims, Osvaldo howled in fury. He railed and called me names on the porch where neighbors could hear. I remember standing by the gate and watching him throw papers like the fit of a man whose identity was tied to displays others could see. Then, in a moment that was almost quiet, he packed a small bag and walked to the car. I watched him go, his silhouette against the late sun, a man leaving behind a life he had expected to curate endlessly. The gate swung shut after him with a finality that felt like the closing of a book. People in the neighborhood said the usual things. Some shrugged, some whispered, some recycled the old jokes as if humor could mend the discomfort. But for me, that closing of the gate was not a spectacle. It was the sound of a boundary that had been set. It was the culmination of a long accumulation of small acts that had taught me how to say no, how to gather evidence, how to speak in a room that had once been the place where I only kept quiet. The Cartorio day arrived with a weather that felt like an exhale, soft wind through the manguera leaves, a sky that was somehow thinner and kinder. We went to the notary office to formalize a settlement that had been negotiated in part and ordered in part. I sat at a table where papers were fanned and stamped, where signatures would be recorded. Henrique stood by with a quiet composure. His presence was not the rescue of a damsel in distress, but the solidarity of someone showing up to make sure the mechanics of life were handled with care. Dr. Adriana guided me through the language of the documents, translating legalese into a plainness I could touch. There were cameras in my imagination more than actual lenses. The notary stamped, the clerk rattled off procedural formalities, and the contract moved from intention to action. The transfer required bureaucratic steps. It required formalities that felt like ritual because rituals make things permanent. I signed where my name belonged. My signature had a weight I had not felt in years, small and undeniable. Once the contract was recorded, there was a period where certain bureaucratic measures were observed. The deposit remained blocked temporarily as part of legal oversight until the judge could issue a final calibration within the divorce action. The house, which had been the subject of a cruel announcement on a neighborhood app, now bore a different set of papers. A clear record that clarified that I had rights and that the property would register in my name in the following weeks. The full legal machinery of transfer and divorce moved in its own slow procedural rhythm. But the crucial thing is this. The house came to be recognized as mine within the framework of a settlement that acknowledged the patterns of the past. Osvaldo left town for a while. When he did call, his voice vacillated between entreaties and sputters of rage. I did not answer most calls. I had learned, in therapy, that boundaries are not only polite pauses, they are survival tools. I had a new set of supports. The lawyer who had helped me translate a domestic life into language a court could accept. The psychologist whose simple exercises had opened a door back into a body that knew how to be both tired and assertive. Neighbors who offered food and witnessed my days in a way that was not judgmental, but human. Life after the cartoria was, in many respects, ordinary work of the kind that heals slowly. The first time I walked through the house alone after the transfer, I felt the texture of the wooden banister under my palm and recognized it as a map of years. I bought new curtains, not as a grandiose declaration, but because I had always wanted curtains that made the room feel warmer. Color in the house shifted from the faded tones that had blanketed our life for decades to something richer. I painted the living room a warm terracotta I had once clipped from a magazine and never dared to choose. The marigolds returned to the garden. I planted a new row and spoke their names aloud as if giving them permission to grow. My friends came over. We ate rice and beans and laughed about small things and old jokes. There were tears too, the kind that come uninvited when you realize that grief and relief can be neighbors. I continued to see Dr. Beatrice. We worked on the slow accretion of habits that build autonomy, checking my finances without shame, answering for my own health appointments, walking to the market and coming home with a bouquet of something bright. She reminded me that identity is not a single revelation. It is the repeat of small acts that say, again and again, I belong to myself. Enrique and I met sometimes, but our conversations were not the songs of a romance being built to save a heroine. They were conversations between two adults who knew the contour of each other's histories and agreed to be honest about what the future might be. He visited as a friend and an ally. In time, we shared dinners that were companionable, where we traded stories about being young in Goiânia, about places we had been, about loss, and about the odd little comforts that kept people steady. He did not play the part of my savior, because there was nothing to be saved in the way our culture often tells that story. I had been gathering myself for years. Instead, he was a witness who helped make truth visible with his means. Days turned into months. The divorce proceedings continued in their formal cadence, but the house's registration eventually reflected the settlement. I am careful in speaking about legal outcomes. I do not mean to present them as universal measures or instructions for others, because the legal world is a complicated one and every story folds into its own facts. For me, the process resulted in the house bearing my name, the legal recognition of what had already existed in small domestic acts for years. That recognition was not a panacea, it was a foundation. The garden changed slowly. I hung a string of small lanterns above the backyard bench that used to sit under the manguera. When night came, the lights made soft halos on the leaves, and there was an intimacy to the way the shadows fell. I invited friends to sit there, and we ate simple meals and talked about small rebellions, learning to cook from scratch, joining a book club, the daring of scheduling a doctor's appointment without asking for permission. People began to see me differently. It was not universal. Some held on to the old ways of speaking about me, the jokes that die hard, but other neighbors looked at me with a different kind of respect. The tolerant nod replaced by a curiosity that suggested they had stopped writing my story from the outside. Children who had once waved at a disembodied aunt in the neighborhood now recognized me by name. A woman from the grocery store said softly, the first time I passed by after the official papers were recorded, "You look like you've put your shoulders back." It was both an observation and a small blessed fact. I continued to keep small records, receipts, notes, photographs. I did not hoard proof as if the world would suddenly demand it again. I kept them because they symbolized a practice of care I had started for myself. They were bookmarks for the kind of honest life I wanted. I began to teach myself to say no without rehearsing apologies. My voice, once thin, then surprised at having enough for one word, grew in a way that was almost imperceptible, like new rings forming in the trunk of a tree. The manguera continued to be a witness to the seasons. One afternoon, some months after the Cartorio day, I sat on the bench and watched a child chase a dog along the street. The sunlight made the leaves glitter. A small wind lifted the scent of citrus from the lemon tree I had planted near the gate. I brewed coffee, still bitter by habit, though it tasted slightly sweeter now, and watched the steam rise. When I lifted the cup, my hands were steady. People asked me sometimes if I felt vindictive or joyful. The honest answer is both and neither. There was a satisfaction in the recognition that the life I had quietly tended could be counted. There was relief in the fact that the house, rooms I had scrubbed, walls I had painted with visions I never asked permission to have, bore my name. But there was also grief. For years evaporated, for small humiliations that had become habit, for the times I had believed my value was measured by the approval of others. Recovery did not erase the past. It made a space in which the past could be acknowledged and then, eventually, integrated. I got a new key made and placed it in my pocket not as a talisman, but as a practical fact. On a weekday, I walked the route to the market and popped into the bakery as if this were the simplest thing. I sat in sunlit cafes and read books I had once shelved away. I took a course in digital literacy because the world, it seems, insists on existing online, and I wanted to feel less alienated from that space. I signed up for a ceramics class at a small community center. Hands in clay felt like a metaphor and an action simultaneously, shaping, pressing, allowing mistakes, and then smoothing them. Over time, the neighborhood's conversation about me changed. The WhatsApp thread that had once been full of jokes about my supposed sale of self trickled into other subjects. People asked about the little cultural events in Sector Jiao, about a new bakery, about where to find a good mango tree. The intense daylight of humiliation softened into a normal view that contained me as a person with a story rather than as a punchline. As for Henrique, our relationship settled into a gentle friendship that allowed tender moments but did not prescribe a playbook for salvation. We met sometimes for coffee and sometimes at the manguera, where each of us sat and watched the birds settle into branches. He would comment on the paint color, and I would tell him how the marigolds had done this year, and we would, in small ways, become a part of each other's calendars. He supported me, yes, in the practical sense of bearing witness that someone with resources had intervened to make certain facts visible in a legal setting. But crucially, he never became the author of my liberation. I had been writing those pages for a long time. I am not the type to offer a morale in a headline. Life remains complicated. I still have unwieldy days. The ache of years does not vanish because a piece of paper is stamped. I still go to therapy. I still keep a notebook where I write small lists of gratitude and small acts that matter. I still sometimes stop when a phrase rises in my mind and tell myself, remember where you came from, and don't let invisibility slip back into your life. The work of self-recognition is habitual. It must be practiced, and yet, there is a quietness now that was not there before. The house, our house, hums with small domestic noises, the kettle on the stove, the lazy rhythm of the washing machine, the scrape of a chair leg. I have new curtains that catch the light in a way that invites me to sit by the window. I sometimes make tea twice in the afternoon and invite a friend. I have repaired old things, mended a tear in a cushion, sanded a chair leg until its groove held my palm like a place that remembers. The manguera continues to shade the yard. Its roots seem to breathe more deeply these months. There are moments I still look at my phone with a quickening in my chest. A blue light can still startle me. But now, when the notifications pile up, I have a hand on the table and another on an inner ledger that says, I have kept a record. I have said no. I have taken steps to ensure a future. That inner ledger is perhaps the most human and the most humble part of this story. I tell you all of this not to offer a guide, but to share that the accumulation of small acts matters. A first no does not usually look heroic. It looks like a woman at a sink who refuses to be next in a litany of small erasures. Therapy is not a magic wand. It is a set of habits and reminders that train you to recognize your worth. Lawyers do not always make fairy tales come true. They are people who translate messy life into the language of courts. Allies arrive in many shapes, some as witnesses, some as lovers, some as hands that hold a bank receipt. The point is not that any single person rescued me. The point is that a community of small decisions, of clear documents, of witnesses, and of personal work gathered until the story could be told differently. If this story resonates with you, please consider subscribing. There are other stories like this, and the small act of listening builds a quieter solidarity. Tell me too in the comments, where are you watching from, and what time is it where you are? I like to imagine the map of small lives stacked beside one another. And one last thing before I go. When I stand by the kitchen sink in the late afternoon and watch the sun through the manguera, I sometimes whisper a phrase I learned in therapy. Simple, a practice not a sermon. Claim the small things. Make a list. Keep paper. Say no. Plant marigolds. Make your coffee bitter or sweet as you like it. The work is not grand, it is persistent. Days become a life if you let them be. Tonight, the light is soft. The house is quiet, except for the sound of a neighbor closing a window and the distant hum of a bus. I poured coffee and sat on the bench under the manguera with my new curtains casting a gentle color across the yard. I listened to the leaves, and for a long time I just let myself be visible to the air. The gate stood closed behind me, not as a barrier, but as a bookend. The house is mine, my name is on its papers. My life is not the captions someone chose for a laugh. If this moved you, share where you're watching from and what time it is. I want to know the small details of the world you live in too. And if you'd like to hear more stories like this, stay with me. There are other lives that deserve to be seen.